failure is not the end. It is the mirror that reflects who you really are becoming. It doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. It strips away what was never truly yours. The illusions, the masks, the assumptions that life owed you comfort if you just did things right. Failure shatters that myth, and in its silence it asks you a question you've never had to answer until now. Who are you without the win? Who are you without the applause? Who are you when effort doesn't give you what you wanted? That question stings, it shakes, it strips, and it leaves you with only one thing left: yourself. Not the version you show the world, but the one that's been waiting for your attention beneath it all. And this is where real life begins. Not in the climb, but in the collapse. Because success may validate you, but failure will rebuild you, stronger, clearer, quieter. Not because it feels good, but because it breaks everything false that once held you up. You stop pretending to have it all together. You stop performing to be seen. You sit with the truth of where you are. And from that place you learn to rise differently. Not out of desperation, out of devotion, not to fix your image, but to realign your purpose. You learn that failure doesn't ruin identity. It reveals depth, and depth was always the goal. Not perfection, not performance. Depth. Because now, you're not chasing results. You're building character, not because you're flawless, but because you're faithful to what you believe even when no one's clapping. Even when there's no reward in sight. Even when all that's left is the breath and the burden and the decision to try again with cleaner hands, with a quieter mind, with a heart that no longer needs to impress to feel worthy. This is the beginning of something real, not a second chance. A truer one. The one that doesn't need explanation. Only integrity. And failure demands integrity. Not the kind that's visible, the kind that's rooted. It asks you, can you keep going, even when they doubt you? Even when you doubt yourself? Can you walk forward without the praise? Can you rebuild without recognition? Because those who do carry something, no trophy can give. They carry grit, they carry grace. They carry the wisdom of falling and finding that the ground is not the enemy, it's the teacher. And in that class, you learn that who you are, when things fall apart, is who you really are. You learn that failing is not failure, unless you let it become your identity. But you don't, because you've decided to look at failure, not as a reflection of your ability, but as a window into your refinement. You're not broken. You're being reshaped. You're not done. You're just beginning a chapter that cannot be skipped. So you walk forward, not with confidence, with courage, not with applause, with alignment, not with answers, with the willingness to keep listening to what life is teaching you through loss. And that is the first lesson. Not that you failed, but that you lived fully enough to try, and that trying is never wasted. It's woven into your becoming, and your becoming has just begun. Failure teaches you what success never will. It teaches you how to rebuild from honesty, not image. Because when everything falls, when plans collapse, when the result is nothing, like the effort you poured into it, there's a silence that settles in, and in that silence you meet yourself, the version that can't hide behind applause, the version that doesn't have a backup plan, the version that can't point fingers because there's no one left to blame. And it's in that version that you discover something sacred. You discover that your value is not attached to the outcome. It's revealed. in your ability to stay grounded when everything around you is shifting, to stay present when everything in you wants to disappear, to stay open, even when everything feels closed. You stop asking, why me? You start asking, what now? Not out of defeat, out of devotion. You stop performing, you start becoming, because failure burns away everything that is not essential. The distractions, the ego, the roles you played to be accepted, the paths you walked to be validated. Failure removes the noise, and in that quiet you hear something you haven't heard in a long time. Your own voice. Not the voice that speaks to impress, the voice that speaks to align. You start trusting that voice again. And that trust becomes your foundation. Because success may build a life, but failure builds a soul that no longer needs to be seen to feel real. A soul that knows the difference between who you are and what you do. Failure separates the two, and in that separation you gain freedom. Freedom to change, to shift, to reroute. Without shame. Because now you've seen that what didn't work was not a sign you're not worthy. It was a sign that something in you was being recalibrated, refined, realigned, reclaimed, and now you show up differently. Not with certainty, but with clarity. Not to impress, to express, not to prove that you are capable, but to live from the place that no longer fears being misunderstood. Because misunderstanding is part of the journey. People won't get it. They'll judge the fall without knowing the climb. But you don't live for their understanding anymore. You live for your own integrity. You live to sleep at night with peace, even if the day didn't go as planned. You live to wake up with the courage to try again, not to repeat the past, but to bring a new version of yourself into the present, one that no longer asks to be rescued, one that no longer waits for permission. You give yourself what you used to beg for: validation, compassion, another chance. And that is everything, because once you stop waiting to be rescued, you start creating your own path from the ashes. Not as revenge, not to prove them wrong, but because you know now that everything you lost was leading you back to what matters. And what matters is not the perfection of the plan, it's the purity of your presence. And you are more present now than ever before. Failure doesn't erase your worth. It exposes where you tied it to the outcome, where you believed you had to succeed to be lovable, where you measured yourself by what stayed and what left. It doesn't take long to realize that failure is not the wound. Attachment is, and you were attached to the timeline, to the story, to the idea that things had to go a certain way to mean something. But now you're learning that meaning doesn't come from the outcome. It comes from how you show up when the outcome is gone. Because when the job ends, when the relationship fails, when the project collapses, what's left is not the title, not the applause, not the dream. What's left is the soul who dared to try. And that soul is not broken. It's not behind. It's not late. It's just raw. And rawness is not weakness. It's where the healing starts. You stop asking, how do I fix this? You start asking, what is this teaching me? And slowly you begin to untangle your identity from the result. You stop saying I failed as if it's who you are, and start saying that didn't work, but I'm still here. Still willing, still growing, still becoming. You don't shrink, you reflect. And from that reflection, you see something you missed before. That your greatest lesson is not in what didn't work, it's in how you held yourself when it didn't. Did you shame yourself? Did you abandon yourself? Did you replay it until you no longer recognized your worth? Or did you breathe? Did you listen? Did you forgive? That forgiveness is where real power begins, because you cannot create from shame. You can only recreate from compassion, and compassion is what failure invites, not as a consolation prize, as a foundation that teaches you to build without needing to prove, to strive without needing to be saved, to walk forward, even when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. You stop fearing the fall because you've already fallen and found yourself still alive, still breathing, still able to begin again, not with the same eyes, with wiser ones, eyes that don't just see opportunity, but timing, but integrity, but alignment. You no longer rush into the next thing to escape the sting. You stay long enough to feel it all, to let it burn away everything that was built on someone else's blueprint. You stop copying other people's paths. You start carving your own, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. And that ownership is the lesson, not the success, not the validation. The quiet, humble knowing that you faced what broke you and rebuilt anyway. That you did not run from your reflection when it looked like disappointment. That you stood still long enough to hear your soul whisper, "Try again." Differently, not desperately. You become different. You stop building from expectation. You start building from embodiment. What feels real? What feels rooted? What feels like it would matter, even if it fails again? Because failure is not the enemy. Self-abandonment is, and you are no longer leaving yourself to chase illusions. You are here now, fully, finally, quietly. Failure humbles you in ways success never will, but it also anchors you in ways you'll never forget. Because when success arrives, you float, you expand, you shine. But when failure lands, you drop, you descend, you touch ground. And that ground is where roots grow, not in the spotlight, not in the applause, but in the silence after the attempt, when no one is looking, when no one is asking, when the world moves on, and you're left with the weight of what didn't work. That's when it begins, not the end, the real beginning. Because now you're building, not for performance, but for permanence. You start to ask better questions, not, how do I make this look good, but what part of me needs to evolve? Not how do I get back to where I was, but what is life trying to shift in me? And those questions take you deeper than success ever could. They take you inward, to the root, to the wound, to the wiring. They ask you to look at the reasons behind the choices, at the beliefs behind the effort. And that mirror isn't easy, but it's honest. It shows you where you were chasing validation instead of vision, where you were striving to be seen instead of serving, where you were saying yes to things that never aligned with your deeper knowing. Failure doesn't just stop the motion, it interrupts the pattern. And in that interruption, you see the truth that success may have hidden. You weren't building from clarity, you were building from fear. And fear is loud until it's met, until you sit with the fear that maybe you're not good enough, that maybe you don't have what it takes. And instead of denying it, you feel it, you name it, you bring it out of the shadow. And when you do, something quiet happens. It loses its grip, because fear cannot lead where truth is welcome. And now you lead with truth, not because you're certain, but because you're ready to be whole. You stop fragmenting. You stop dividing your identity by wins and losses. You start integrating your effort, your intention, your evolution. You see, that failure doesn't take you backwards. It slows you down so you can become who you were meant to be, before the noise, before the pressure, before the illusion that speed equals progress. You stop chasing timelines that were never yours. You stop sprinting toward versions of success that never felt true. You walk now, not out of exhaustion, out of wisdom, because you've seen what it costs to run on empty. You felt what it takes to build from misalignment, and now you're done building from scarcity. You choose wholeness, even if it's slower, even if it means starting over, even if it means saying no to what everyone else calls an opportunity. Because if it costs your peace, it's not success. If it pulls you from presence, it's not the path. If it asks you to abandon your values, it's not worth it. And that discernment was born in the wreckage, not in the celebration, not in the win. It was born when you sat in the ruins of your own expectations and finally asked what actually matters. And you listened. You heard. You heard that what matters is not how fast you get there, but how honest you are on the way. Not how many people clap, but how many times you choose to get up when no one's watching. Not how much you gain, but how much of yourself you refuse to lose just to feel like you're ahead. You've redefined what ahead means. It means aligned. It means rested. It means present, and you are finally all three. Not because it's easy, but because you chose to let failure do what success couldn't, to shape you from the inside out, quietly, completely, permanently. Failure refines your standards, not just in what you pursue, but in who you become while pursuing it. It stops you from settling, not because it makes you bitter, but because it wakes you up to the things you once accepted out of fear, to the people you once chased out of loneliness, to the habits you once clung to because they felt familiar. Failure is not just about what you lost, it's about what you refuse to repeat. You look back and realize that some of what broke needed to break. Not because you deserved pain, but because the path you were on was too small for the truth of who you were becoming. So it fell apart, so you could build again from something real. Failure doesn't harden you. It clarifies you. It sharpens your eye for what matters. It deepens your respect for process. It strengthens your loyalty to truth. You stop being impressed by fast success. You start honoring slow integrity. Because now you know what it feels like to build without roots, to reach without reflection, to win without wholeness. And you don't want that anymore. You don't want to live a life that looks good but feels hollow. You don't want to keep saying yes to things that ask you to abandon your voice. You don't want to repeat cycles just because they're safe. You want what's real. And failure has made you brave enough to say that out loud, to ask for it, to wait for it, to walk toward it even when the road is unclear. You've stopped rushing. You've stopped comparing. You've stopped demanding that life looks a certain way by a certain time. Because failure taught you that time doesn't determine your value. Character does. Consistency does. Self-respect does. And you now protect your self-respect like it's sacred. Because it is. Because you know how long you lived without it. How many moments you swallowed your truth to keep the peace. How many opportunities you said yes to out of fear of disappointing someone else. You see it now, all of it, not with shame but with wisdom. You see that the version of you who failed was the version who tried, who risked, who showed up, who believed. And that belief is not something you should ever regret. It's something you should build upon. You now build not from blame, but from bravery. You don't need closure to move forward. You need clarity, and failure has given you that. Clarity on what matters. Clarity on what drains you. clarity on what brings you home to yourself. You stop negotiating with your values. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop performing to be chosen, because failure showed you that the cost of self-abandonment is too high. You'd rather walk away than shrink again. You'd rather be misunderstood than misaligned. You'd rather start over than stay stuck. And that is a kind of power no external win can give you. It's the power of knowing you are not for everyone. And that's okay. You are for truth, for depth, for something that doesn't need to be popular to be right. And now you walk differently. You speak differently. Not louder, clearer, not faster, straighter. Not to convince, but to confirm that you are still becoming who you said you'd be, even when no one is watching. Even when the last attempt didn't go as planned. Because you are not the outcome. You are the intention. You are the integrity. You are the quiet, relentless unfolding of a standard that can't be shaken by failure. Failure builds foundations you can actually trust, not because they're perfect, but because they've been tested. Tested in your lowest moments. Tested when no one showed up. Tested when the applause disappeared, and all you had was your breath and the decision to begin again. That's the part no one teaches. That's the part no mentor, no system, no book can walk you through. Only life can. Only falling and still waking up. Only losing and still learning. Only failing and still loving. Because now you don't love yourself because of how far you've come. You love yourself because of how honest you've become in the process. You love yourself for how you stayed when it was easier to leave. You love yourself for how you showed up when no one was looking. You love yourself because you no longer abandon yourself just to be accepted. And that is real success. Not the numbers, not the praise, not the milestones, but the integrity to stand in the mirror and say I kept going, not perfectly, but faithfully. I didn't quit on myself, even when it hurt, even when it embarrassed me, even when it humbled me to dust. I kept going. And that is the part no one sees. The invisible story, the spiritual weight of persistence, the kind that doesn't shout, that doesn't post, that doesn't demand recognition. It just breathes and walks and endures because it knows that failure is not the opposite of growth. It's the soil growth grows from. The soil that taught you to stop rushing, to stop begging, to stop proving. The soil that taught you to start listening, to start remembering, to start living. Like your peace matters more than your performance. And now you live differently. You don't chase certainty. You practice presence. You don't wait for guarantees. You walk in alignment. You don't expect perfection. You commit to learning. You've stopped waiting for the moment when everything finally makes sense. Because now you understand that life is not about clarity before the leap. It's about courage during the fall. And in that fall you discovered a part of yourself that no wind could have revealed. The part that didn't run. The part that sat with the shame. That breathed through the panic. That let go of the identity that was never real. You buried it. And from that burial you grew roots. Not flashy ones. Quiet ones. Sturdy ones. Sacred ones. And now you build from those roots. You speak from those roots. You create from those roots. You relate from those roots. You choose peace over pressure. You choose depth over speed. You choose truth over image. And that changes everything. Because now you don't just know who you are when things work out. You know who you are when they don't. And that knowing is unshakable. Because it was earned. In the dark. In the silence. In the waiting. In the wilderness. And now you carry that wilderness inside you, not as a wound, but as wisdom, not as a weakness, but as a quiet, permanent strength. Failure ends the illusion that your worth depends on the outcome and begins the truth that it never did. You start to see that the moment everything collapsed was not the end. It was the unraveling of the identity you built to survive. You were surviving in performance, in perfection, in pleasing. You were surviving in trying to make life make sense by making yourself smaller. But failure doesn't allow that anymore. It tears it away. The costume, the act, the illusion. It puts you face to face with what's real. What remains when all the strategies stop working? What stays when the effort no longer gets you applause? You're left with breath, and presence, and a kind of stillness you never asked for. But that stillness becomes a sanctuary. Because it's in that stillness you realize you've been living too far outside of yourself. Always reaching, always fixing, always explaining. But now you breathe differently. You don't fight the silence. You let it teach you that not everything broken needs to be glued back, that not every ending needs a restart. Sometimes the greatest act of growth is in not rebuilding what no longer feels like home, and that includes versions of you that made sense back then, but no longer do now. You've grown. You've softened. You've opened. Not because you finally succeeded, but because you finally surrendered. Surrendered to the lesson. Surrendered to the becoming. Surrendered to the fact that the goal was never about the win. It was about what was revealed in the losing. You stop chasing arrival. You start choosing alignment. You stop obsessing over destination. You start practicing direction. And that direction is no longer frantic. It's not loud. It's not desperate. It's deliberate. It's soft. It's aware. You walk slowly now, not because you're afraid, but because you're awake. You see more. You need less. You listen deeper. And from that listening you realize you no longer fear the fall. Because it was in the fall, you found the ground, not rock bottom, but sacred earth. The kind that welcomes what's real, what's rooted, what's resilient. And you are resilient, not because you always bounce back, but because you remain. You stay soft. You stay open. You stay honest. Even when it hurts. Even when it doesn't go as planned. Even when you feel unseen. You no longer chase visibility. You've chosen integrity. And integrity doesn't need an audience. It only needs truth. Truth. That you are no longer performing to feel worthy. Truth. That you are no longer negotiating with what your soul knows. Truth. That you are still here, breathing, becoming, without forcing, without faking, without waiting for permission. You're no longer waiting. You're living, not fast, but full. Not for show, for real. And that is the lesson failure never stops teaching. That you were never the outcome. You were always the one becoming through it. Failure stripped the noise so you could hear what's always been quietly true. That success isn't what makes you valuable. That achievement isn't what makes you whole. That praise isn't what makes you safe. You've chased all of it. You've burned yourself for the applause. You've bent yourself for belonging. You've lost yourself for acceptance and failure. Put a stop to that, not out of cruelty, out of mercy. It ended the chase. It ended the narrative that you had to earn what was already yours: peace, worth, enoughness. These things were never on the outside. They were buried under years of noise, And now you're quiet enough to feel them again, to feel peace without needing everything to be perfect, to feel worthy without doing more, to feel whole even in the aftermath. This is what failure gave you. Not the lesson, but the return, the homecoming to yourself. Not the version of you that was curated, but the one that was always enough, even when they walked away, even when it didn't work out, even when everything fell apart. That version still breathes, still walks, still lives without needing to be proven. And now you let that version lead. You don't live through your performance anymore. You live through your presence. You show up not to impress, but to serve. You contribute, not to be praised, but because it aligns. You create, not to be remembered, but because expression is part of your aliveness. You stopped trying to be the best. You started choosing what's honest. You stopped obsessing over more. You started honoring what's already here. And in that shift, everything began to change. Not because life got easier, but because you got quieter. Quieter in your mind, quieter in your fear, quieter in your demand that things always make sense. You don't need it to make sense anymore. You need it to be true. And truth is not always clean. It's not always clear, but it always frees you. And freedom is now your measure. Not recognition, not rank, not result. But the question, does this choice bring me back to myself or pull me further away? That is the compass now, and you don't betray it. Not for speed, not for security, not for validation, because you've already lived in the noise of self-abandonment, and silence is so much softer. You don't beg life to be easy anymore. You ask it to be real, and what's real isn't always what's visible. It's what returns when everything else leaves. It's the breath after loss, the decision after rejection, the quiet after collapse. That's what stays, and what stays is what's sacred. You've stopped trying to hold everything together. You've learned to hold yourself instead, to rest, to listen, to allow. And in that allowing, you've become someone you can trust. Not someone who always wins, someone who always returns to the deeper yes, to the aligned no, to the part of you that never needed fixing, only remembering. And now you remember, and in that remembering you rise, not back to who you were, but forward into who you are when there is nothing left to protect and everything left to live. Failure didn't end you. It refined you, quietly, thoroughly, permanently. It stripped away the things you once thought were essential. The noise, the pressure, the illusion that strength meant never falling. But you fell, and in that fall, you found something you didn't even know you'd lost. Your center, not the version of you that tried to hold everything together, but the version that could sit in the ashes without flinching. You stopped running, stopped hiding, stopped fixing yourself to feel acceptable. You faced it. The failure, the regret, the grief, the feeling of not being enough. And you didn't avoid it. You absorbed it. You let it teach you, shape you, quiet you, because now you understand that failure isn't a detour. It's a descent, not downward, but inward, into the very truth you'd been building your life to avoid. That your worth is not in what you earn, not in what you win, not in what they see. It's in how you carry yourself when there's nothing left to carry. And still you show up. Still you breathe. Still you choose to rebuild. Not because you need redemption, but because you're done living someone else's idea of success. You're not building to impress anymore. You're building to align. You're not moving to escape your past. You're moving to embody your truth, and your truth no longer depends on external confirmation. It lives in you, in how you say no without explanation, in how you pause before responding, in how you stand when everything around you asks you to shrink. Failure taught you not to flinch when plans fall apart, but to listen, to ask what version of me is being called forward by this unraveling. And when the answer comes, it's never about being better. It's about being truer. Truer to the boundaries you once violated to be liked. Truer to the vision you once watered down to be understood. Truer to the stillness you once ignored to stay busy. Because busy was a mask. But failure tore the mask off, and what's left isn't perfect, but it's honest. And that honesty is worth everything. Because now you wake up and you're not faking it. You speak and you're not performing. You connect and you're not controlling. You're just present. And presence is enough. Failure showed you that you don't need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. You need to be real. And now you are. Not because it's always easy, but because it's finally aligned. Aligned with what matters. Aligned with what you value. Aligned with the part of you that stopped pretending. You've stopped pretending. And that is freedom. The kind you don't shout about. The kind you don't post. The kind that lives in your nervous system, in your relationships, in your routines. It's in how you sit with discomfort. It's in how you say that didn't work, and still I'm proud of myself. It's in how you no longer make success a condition for self-love. Because failure isn't the opposite of worth. It's the revealer of what's real. And what's real is you. Still breathing. Still becoming. Still here. Failure taught you how to live without applause, how to breathe without proving, how to show up without needing to be seen. You stopped chasing validation in places that never knew what it meant to see you clearly. You stopped trying to explain your heart to people who only listened to correct it. You stopped performing your resilience like a badge you had to constantly polish, and in that stopping, you became real. Failure removed the layers, not just of what didn't work, but of who you thought you had to be. You no longer build your life to impress the world. You build it to align with your soul. And that alignment is silent, invisible, sacred. It's how you choose to rest when everything says push. It's how you hold your ground when the pressure says bend. It's how you love yourself when the mirror reflects an unfinished version. You stopped needing to finish to feel worthy. You stopped needing to win to feel seen. You stopped needing to speak to feel heard. Because now, you listen to yourself. Not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's uncomfortable. You sit with the tension. You breathe through the questions. You let go of the image of who you were supposed to be. You stopped chasing milestones. You started honoring seasons. And in this season, you are softer, slower, wiser. You are not rushing toward the version of you that makes people comfortable. You are returning to the version of you that makes you whole. That version doesn't always have the answer, but she knows how to ask the right questions. She doesn't always get it right, but she never stops choosing what's real, and what's real is no longer complicated. It's peace, it's breath, it's presence, it's choosing to go home without explaining why you left the party early. It's choosing to rest without posting that you're taking time off. It's choosing to say no without needing to soften it. It's choosing to walk away without making it a lesson for someone else. Because you are no longer responsible for how others process your growth. You are only responsible for honoring it. And honoring it means living slower, living simpler, living in ways that let your nervous system know you're safe. Not because life is easy, but because you stopped making life harder by denying what's true. The truth is, you're enough now. Not when you heal, not when you succeed, not when you're chosen. Now, even in the confusion, even in the rebuilding, even in the space between who you were and who you are becoming. You belong here, not for what you offer, but for who you are when you stop offering anything. That version of you deserves rest, deserves kindness, deserves to breathe without doing. And now you let her. Because failure was never the enemy. It was the gatekeeper. The pause, the redirection, the clearing of everything you never needed to begin with. And now you know what to carry forward. Not everything, not everyone. Only what brings you back to yourself. Only what reminds you that you were always on your way. Even when it looked like you were lost. Even when it felt like you were behind. You were always becoming. And now, you no longer chase proof. You walk with presence, and presence needs nothing added to be enough. Failure never asked for your perfection. It asked for your presence, and you answered. Not with control, not with bravado, but with something far more powerful. You answered by staying when you had every reason to run. When the plan failed, when the noise stopped, when the identity crumbled, when no one showed up to tell you it was okay, you still stayed, and that is what changed everything. You stopped waiting to feel whole before showing up. You stopped pretending that everything made sense. You stopped chasing what never belonged to you to begin with. Because failure revealed something no success ever could, that your life was never about getting it all right. It was about remembering that you were already enough, even when everything went wrong. That you were not defined by what you could hold together, but by what you refused to abandon even when everything fell apart. You didn't abandon yourself, not this time. And that became your quiet revolution. You started showing up without the costume, without the script, without the performance you'd rehearsed for so long. You showed up with questions instead of answers, with breath instead of certainty, with softness instead of strategy. And the world didn't know what to do with that. Because you were no longer feeding the system that rewards pretending. You were moving from a deeper place, a place that didn't need permission to exist, a place that had been waiting to be lived from, and now you live from it. You speak without filtering truth through fear. You walk without rushing toward a finish line. You rest without earning it first, because you've stopped seeing yourself as a project to fix. You're not a problem, you're a presence. And presence doesn't perform. It simply is. It's the way you breathe, in a room where you used to shrink. It's the way you hold eye contact with your own reflection. It's the way you sit with your pain without rushing it to go. Because now you don't fear discomfort. You understand that discomfort is a doorway, one that leads back to yourself. So you open it, again and again, and you walk through even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because you know that avoidance is the slowest kind of suffering, and you're done suffering to look successful. You'd rather be free, even if it's messy, even if it's misunderstood, even if it means letting go of what once defined you. Because definitions can't contain who you've become. You're no longer who you were before the fall. You're quieter, more grounded, more aware. Not because you figured it out, but because you stopped trying to. You stopped gripping life with a clenched fist. You opened, and in that opening you found the strength to let life move through you instead of around you. You stopped being afraid of being broken. You realized you were already cracked open, and through that crack came light. Not the kind that needs to be seen, but the kind that helps you see yourself. others, the truth. And that seeing is the gift. That staying is the power. That breathing is the proof. That failure was never about losing. It was about remembering how to live without forgetting who you are. Failure didn't close your story. It opened the chapter where you finally became real, not polished, not perfected, just present. It stripped you of everything performative, of the voices that said you had to do more, be more, prove more, to be enough. And in that stripping, you weren't left empty. You were left honest. Honest about your fears, honest about your limits, honest about what matters. You no longer perform strength. You embody stillness. You no longer chase clarity. You walk with curiosity. You no longer demand answers. You rest in awareness, because failure didn't make you bitter. It made you gentle. Gentle with yourself. Gentle with others. Gentle with the process. You stopped expecting yourself to always get it right. You started honoring yourself for showing up at all. And in that honoring, you reclaimed a truth you forgot along the way. That being human isn't a flaw. It's a feature. That you were never meant to master life, only to live it fully, softly, bravely, and bravery no longer looks like bold declarations. It looks like getting up again. It looks like resting when you need to. It looks like saying no without guilt, saying yes without fear. It looks like creating without needing to monetize. It looks like loving without needing to control. It looks like breathing without rushing to fix. Because now you understand that fixing was never the point. Presence was. Not presence for others. Presence with yourself. You sit with discomfort. Not to conquer it, but to listen. You meet your doubts. Not to silence them, but to learn what they're guarding. You hold your grief, not as a problem, but as a memory of how deeply you loved. And all of this quiet work, all of this invisible repair, all of this returning, this is what success really is. Not the win, not the numbers, not the image, but the ability to remain in your body, in your truth, in your breath, when it all falls apart, and still whisper, I'm still here, not for the world, for me, for the part of me that never gave up, that never stopped believing, that never let go of what was sacred, even when everything else slipped away. You now walk with that part of you in everything you do. You build from it, speak from it, connect from it, rest with it, because it's not about the destination anymore. It's about the devotion. Devotion to integrity, to softness, to presence, to peace. And peace is not a prize, it's a practice. One you return to, not when you've earned it, but because you need it. Because you finally know that you don't have to do anything to deserve it. You just have to stop running from yourself. And you have. You've stopped running. You've started breathing. You've started living from the part of you that doesn't need to be seen to be real. That doesn't need to be loud to be strong. That doesn't need to be first to be whole. This is who you are now. Not because you succeeded, but because you stayed, and staying changed you quietly, thoroughly, permanently.